Good morning and welcome to Church at Home with Rachael for Thursday, February the 3rd, I think. For Thursday, February the 3rd. Today I'd like to talk to you about a topic a little bit less heavy as I have been talking the last couple of days. Today I would like to talk to you about the words that we use and the way we use them. I remember when my stepson was about maybe 10 years old, and I was very conscious about not swearing in front of him. I do swear from time to time. I shouldn't, but I do. I need to learn to use my words better. And I'm not a sailor. I don't swear like that. It's just, every once in a while the wrong word comes out. But I remember being aware of something in front of him, in front of Dan. He was about 10, and being really conscious of making sure that I chose my words carefully. And for whatever it is, I said, "Oh, for Pete's sake." And he just looked at me. And he was just like, "Rachael, why would you say that?" And I couldn't figure out why he was so upset that I would say "for Pete's sake." It's a phrase. We say it all the time. And then I remembered that his mom had a very good friend who was very much like a father figure to Dan, at home when he was in Sarnia. And his name was Pete. And when I said, "Oh, for Pete's sake," he thought I was somehow taking Pete's name in vain. And I'd never, ever thought about it that way. It's like the term lazy Susan, this spinning thing that you put on a table or you'll have in a corner cupboard or something. Again, it's like with Dan, his mom's name is Susan. And I mentioned something about a lazy Susan one time that my family had when I was a kid. And he got really upset. And I realized, oh, wow. So never since then have I used the term lazy Susan, or heard it used, or used the term "for Pete's sakes," or heard someone else say it, and not thought about Dan and the implications that something as innocent as those names being used that way could mean. I was watching a video of Barbara Taylor Brown, speaking, not really a sermon, but more of a talk, and she used the words "good grief" and "holy envy." And she was speaking about someone who had been speaking about something that she'd heard. And the idea of good grief, growing up with that, I'm pretty sure we all heard Lucy from the Peanuts gang saying "good grief, Charlie Brown." It's an sort of an expression of exasperation, like, "Oh, good grief, for Pete's sake," that kind of thing. And I got thinking about that as Barbara was speaking. I thought, good grief. Those are two words that we put together, but probably shouldn't normally be put together. Good grief. When they say it about Charlie Brown, "Good grief, Charlie Brown," it's a point of exasperation. It's a wondering, what the heck? Really? But those words, good and grief, they seem like they are almost oxymoronic. Like they can't possibly be put together. Like idiot savant, an idiot who knows everything, seems like an oxymoron. And yet these are words that when we say them, they mean something really quite profound. And good grief, I don't think that I know I don't use that phrase very often ever, but if I did, it would certainly not be in the sense of what those two words mean and what they mean when they're juxtaposed together in their true intention. When good grief is talked about in not an exasperated "good grief, Charlie Brown" kind of way, good grief tells us something about grieving. That grieving can be something that is positive. That there is such a thing as good grief. Now, I'm sure we all know, or maybe have experienced, those moments or pockets of time in which we have experienced bad grief. A grief that either rips us apart so badly we're not able to function, or we see somebody else who is wallowing and they can't get out of their grief. They cannot move beyond a feeling of despair and aloneness that they're feeling in their grief. And that is a horrible place to be, I think, if you are experiencing and living through that sense of bad grief. But what could good grief do? Grieving and my sense of understanding what grieving is that sense of place where you're acknowledging that something has been ripped away from you, that some aspect or essence of your life is no longer there. It doesn't have to be permanent. I remember when Rob deployed the first time, but more particularly the second time when he went away for 8 months, and I knew that I wouldn't see him. He left in the middle of July, and I knew I wouldn't see him till the end of February, and I grieved him. I could talk to him on the phone a few times during that time, and we had email, but having his presence in my life, having his sense, his smell, having his socks on the living room floor, having the food that he cooked, the laughter he brings into my life, having those things not there, even though it was for a determined amount of time, I felt grief, and I felt things more deeply in that grief as well. And I think why I know it was good grief is because the other things that I felt, those joys, one of those joys was 2 little kids, Tristan and Kylie. They were friends. They were one of the gentlemen that Rob was sailing with. His wife and I got to be friends, and she's on her own with these 2 little kids, and they became sort of like my surrogate kids. I loved them, and we played together, and we did special things for their parents at Christmas, and while Rob was gone, I was allowed to have these 2 beautiful children, Tristan and Kylie, in my life as part of my new family, my deployment family. And I noticed that when I was with them, I felt things bigger. I felt things more profoundly than I did when, in other periods of my life when I was dealing with other children and things like that. And I think what it was is that my heart broke open in grief when Rob left. And in that breaking open, I was very raw. I was very emotionally sensitive. And that there were lots of times when that was a very difficult kind of grief. It was a sadness and an aloneness, knowing that they're the person that you would share a story with or turn to in times of sorrow or bounce ideas off of is not there. Again, I was blessed because I knew that time would come to an end. But I think it gave me a foretaste of what it will be in a time when I will grieve for someone that I love, that I will see no longer on this plane. So that sense of grief, I allowed myself to feel it. I didn't pretend it wasn't there. I watched other people pretend that they didn't feel anything, and I watched them implode. I watched people that I cared about, that I came to care about, not dealing well with this feeling that the person was gone, and this idea that you have to keep a stiff upper lip and just charge ahead and just pretend that nothing's wrong. I think that's bad grief. I think the good grief is the kind that allows you to feel so deeply and feel the raw and the pain, because pain does not kill us. Pain allows us to know that we are still feeling, that we have senses and we have sensitivity. Pain allows us the gift of recognizing that we can still feel. And if we can still feel, and you're that raw because you're in your grief, then when a child laughs, or when a child comes up and tells you they love you, or sits up on your knee and whispers a joke in your ear, there's an even greater sense of joy that I think is not there when we're not feeling grief, when our heart is fully whole and fully healed and we're just going about day to day. When our heart has been broken open and we have that rawness there, we're in a time of grieving. I think that we can feel, we feel everything greater than we normally would. But that includes joy. That includes peace. That includes awe and wonder at God's world. That sense that we are more able in that rawness, in that super sensitivity that grief brings us, it opens us up to more than simply the pain of grief, but it opens us up, all of us up, into recognizing and being able to be present to the goodness of life. I don't wish grief upon anyone. Never, because it is painful. But at the same time, because we all do have to go into grief, I pray that you, if you have grief, will also be able to recognize the good kind of grief and the goodness that comes out of grief. That sensitivity to beauty and hope and creativity. That ability to feel love so beautifully and to know that part of why you are grieving, part of why you feel so much pain, is because you have loved deeply. There is such a thing as good grief. Not just the good grief, Charlie Brown kind of good grief, but that good grief that comes out of knowing that you have loved and you have so much love to give. But in that healing time, in that time of walking through the grief, also knowing that you are now ultra sensitive to recognizing joy and peace and love and beauty, the laughter of a child, the touch on your face of someone else, the beauty of a colored leaf flying through the wind in the fall, the scent of a rose. All of these things can be experienced in an even greater way, I think, when we are in the midst of good grief. If you are grieving this day, I pray that you will know good grief. And if you are not grieving, then be aware of those who are, and enter into their lives and help them to see the goodness that grief can be and can bring. God bless you, and I will see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachael.